All right, today we are diving headfirst into one of the biggest, oldest, and frankly, most difficult questions in all of philosophy. This is a big one, something that has kept thinkers up at night for thousands of years.
I mean, it's a question I bet every single one of us has asked at some point, right? You look at the world around you, you turn on the news, you think about history, or even just what's happening in your own life, and there's just so much suffering. So if there's supposed to be this perfect, all-good being in charge, what gives?
And you know, that question isn't just some passing thought. It's actually a formal philosophical challenge, and it has a name, the problem of evil. And this isn't some new thing either. It has been a core debate for literally thousands of years, really putting the entire idea of a good God to the test.
And this just shows you how far back this puzzle goes. We're talking ancient Greece. The philosopher Epicurus laid it out with this just brutal clarity more than 2,000 years ago. It's this perfect little logic trap that really seems to paint the idea of a perfect God into a corner.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this debate, we first have to be clear about what we even mean by evil, because as it turns out, philosophers usually split it into two very different categories.
So on one side, you've got what's called moral evil. This is all the terrible stuff that we humans do to each other. War, cruelty, things like that. But then there's this other category, natural evil. This is the suffering that comes from the world itself, stuff like earthquakes, diseases, tsunamis. And getting this distinction right is, well, it's absolutely essential for the rest of this conversation.
But here's where it gets really, really tough. Inside both of those categories, the biggest challenge is something philosophers call gratuitous suffering. We're not talking about pain that teaches you a lesson or makes you a better person. No, this is suffering that seems to have no point at all. It just feels random and cruel.
And this example just hits you right in the gut. The philosopher William Rowe came up with this devastating thought experiment. A faun, alone in a forest fire. There's no human here making a bad choice, there's no character being built, no lesson being learned, just horrible, lonely agony. This is exactly the kind of suffering that just stops even the most clever philosophical arguments dead in their tracks.
So, how do you even begin to respond to that? Well, let's look at the most famous answer out there. It's a defense that takes on moral evil, the human-caused stuff, head-on. It's called the free will defense, and it was famously argued by the philosopher Alvin Plantinga. The core idea is pretty straightforward. For things like love and goodness to actually mean anything, people have to be able to choose them freely. But, and this is the huge but, that very freedom means they also have to be able to choose not to be good, and that comes with a terrible risk.
So the logic kind of goes like this. Step 1. A world filled with genuinely free creatures is way better than a world full of mindless puppets who just do what they're told. Step 2. For that freedom to be real, the choice to do bad things has to be on the table. So here's the kicker. God couldn't create free people who are somehow programmed to always choose the good thing. That wouldn't be freedom at all. For someone who believes, this is huge. It means you have to accept that free will is more important than being 100% safe all the time.
Okay, but you see the immediate problem, right? The free will defense, it's a pretty strong argument for why one person might hurt another. But what about our faun in the fire? What does free will have to do with a natural disaster like an earthquake or a disease like cancer? It just doesn't seem to apply at all.
And that's where a different kind of argument comes in, something called a theodicy. A theodicy is basically an attempt to explain why a good God might allow evil to exist. And these arguments, they try to find a purpose behind all of it, not just the stuff we humans are responsible for.
So one of the big ones is the soul-making theodicy, which comes from the philosopher John Hick. The idea is to think of the world not as a finished paradise, but more like a spiritual gym. The hardships, the pain, the challenges, those are the weights we have to lift to build up our spiritual muscles, things like courage, compassion, and patience. The whole point of being here, in this view, isn't to be comfortable, it's to grow.
But again, this argument runs straight into some absolutely heartbreaking problems. How does an infant dying of a horrible disease build character? What virtue is that teaching? A lot of the time, the sheer amount of suffering and who it happens to seems to have absolutely nothing to do with personal growth.
So this pushes some thinkers in a totally different direction. They start to ask, well, maybe the problem isn't God's plan. Maybe the problem is us, our limited perspective. This idea is called skeptical theism, and it basically argues that we're like ants trying to understand a supercomputer.
We're just in no position to look at some instance of suffering and declare with any confidence that it's truly pointless. And the go-to analogy really makes it click. Think about a little kid getting a shot at the doctor's office. The parent holds them down while a stranger pokes them with a needle. From the kid's point of view, it's just pure, senseless torture. They can't possibly understand the reason for it. Skeptical theism proposes that maybe, just maybe, our relationship to God and the suffering in the world is kind of like that. It's a view that really leans on humility, admitting we just might not have all the answers. So far, all the arguments we've looked at try to work within the standard traditional definition of God. But for a lot of people, these answers just don't feel satisfying. And that leads to a much more radical question. What if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the problem isn't the evil, but our very definition of God?
Yeah, this is a huge pivot. Think about it. All those previous arguments, they assumed God is like an all-powerful king controlling everything. But what if that's the very assumption that's causing the problem in the first place?
And this is where something called process theology comes into the picture. And it totally reimagines the nature of God. So instead of a divine king on a throne who micromanages everything, this view sees God more as a persuasive force. A force that is constantly luring and guiding a free, messy, unpredictable universe toward more beauty and complexity, but without ever forcing its hand.
So, let's break that down. In the classical view, God's power is absolute. It's coercive. God can just make things happen. In process theology, that power is persuasive. In the old model, God knows the future because it's already written. In this new model, God knows every possible future, but doesn't control which one actually happens. The creator and the creation are sort of in it together, evolving and changing over time.
And here is the crucial takeaway. In this way of thinking, the suffering of that fawn in the forest, it's not part of some secret, mysterious plan. It's a tragic, random, and unavoidable consequence of a universe that has real freedom baked into it at every single level, from the tiniest particles all the way up to us. God doesn't will it to happen. God feels that suffering with the world, but can't just snap his fingers and stop it.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The problem of evil, as we've known it for centuries, really comes from one very specific, classical idea of what God is. So maybe, just maybe, the final answer isn't about finding the perfect excuse for suffering. Maybe the real question is whether our very concept of God can evolve, to better fit a universe that we now see as messy, unpredictable, and constantly surprising.